Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this symposium. My name is Levente Sulyok, and I would like to tell you a little bit about my process of making in relationship to the work that is included in the Remediations exhibition. But before that, I would like to thank Director Leslie Loxi Chen and curators Nicole Burisch and Sally Frater for making this exhibition possible. I chose to make this presentation formal, and therefore, because of the time limit, I hope this is neither too hurried or too dry. Before I speak about my work, it's necessary to outline the historical context. My work considers the shortcomings of nationalism, especially with an authoritarian streak, which seems to be re-emerging across the Western world. My particular focus is the nation of Hungary, and I look at the complex origins and folk traditions of the nation which defy borders and the nation-state. Current right-wing nationalism is a response to the EU experiment with its open borders, fluid migration, and an at least perceived loss of national identity. It is also a response to our communist past, which I will highlight in the next slide. In summary, Hungarians are a mix of Finno-Ugric forest dwellers called Magyars from northeast of Hungary and the other nomadic tribes listed here, including the Huns located east and south to current Hungary. There are also various Germanic influences throughout history. Hungary, in general, seems to be a transitional space between the East and the West, both culturally and in terms of religion. The kingdom was occupied by foreign powers for most of its history, and this is the map of Hungary at the start of World War I, when Austria-Hungary entered a war with Germany as part of the Central Powers, and this alliance repeats in World War II. Upon losing the war, this is what happened to Hungary's borders based on the Treaty of Trianon, which was signed in 1920 in France. This is just one example of the territory changes in the nation's history over the past 1,000 years. This trauma is part of the backdrop to current right-leaning nationalism. As you see, 1 in 3 of all Hungarians now lives outside of Hungary. Also note that the large Romanian region of Transylvania contains 1.5 million Hungarians, and this region was part of Hungary until 1920. Ior Ducescu was a civil engineer who helped to relocate many Romanian churches marked for destruction during the 1980s under Ceausescu's communist regime. I included this image to suggest that even physical borders based on the built environment are unreliable, so drawing lines between cultures which are by nature malleable and porous is futile. The second image shows the interior of a Hungarian Reformationist church in Transylvania. There is, as you can see, none of the pomp and circumstance of the Catholic Church, just the simple handiwork done by members of this particular church while in the process of prayer. Based on this history, here are my research parameters. Observations on our response to loss. Mourning the past and desiring a return to some origin, which leads to an authoritarian brand of nationalism, where the past is often an idealized version of official histories mixed with visual projections towards an imaginary future. Recent history illustrates the following. Porous folk culture is pitted against pure national origin. Cultural diversity is in contrast to national homogenization, and adaptation and hybridity is in contrast to purification and cleansing. Initial concepts of the work: borders, physical and cultural, porous folk traditions, concepts of loss and mourning, de- and re-territorialization, and embodied versus mediated culture. This image shows the work included in this exhibition in progress. My base materials include antique folk weavings from before 1920, appropriated embroidery patterns before 1920, other antique artifacts, display cases to engage with the language of museology. In my process, I combine patterns and weavings of Hungarian origin both inside and outside current national borders. I highlight the loss of cultural context by framing and representing artifacts. I raise support versus pattern hierarchy. I complicate digital versus material origin and hope to embody hybridity through translation, which is to say sound to image conversion. This is the first piece I made in this body of work. It features 3 panels. The center is a Hungarian weaving flanked by 2 Romanian weavings. And as you can see, the standardized format forced me to add fabric in some cases and also allowed me to fold back excess fabric into this kind of standardized format. I also included with the machine the web address to the location of the images of these artifacts as I found them on the internet. This is the first 3D work that I made in this body of work, which quite literally embodies the concept of loss. It features a morning dress from Slovakia, which was made in an ethnically Hungarian region, but after 1920 when the region became part of Slovakia. The enclosure plays on the dynamics between the past enclosed artifact, our narration of it, which is suggested by the museum display case, and our projections toward an imaginary future as illustrated by our reflection on the dark blue enclosure. I focus on folk traditions precisely because they seem to defy national borders by existing both inside and outside of them. My inclusion of the web address to the location of each artifact as found in the global marketplace further complicates conversations about origin. So this is an image of the actual work in the exhibition. These folk weavings are considered peasant textiles, and that is determined by the vertical seams that you see here due to the small size of the loom on which they were made. This particular piece is made out of 3 strips. So in Birdsong Red, I borrowed a pattern which is featured on a shepherd cape that was produced actually very close to where I grew up. And that pattern I embroidered onto the antique fabric, which is from Slovakia, but made by a Hungarian. You see the tagline there from Etsy or eBay: antique Slovak linen peasant textile woven homespun tablecloth ritual cloth folk. So I embroidered these taglines into the work itself, as well as the web address to the location of both the fabric as I found it online and the pattern itself. This is an antique cape. It is important to mention that both men and women were embroiderers. Most of these capes were done by men, whereas domestic objects like pillowcases were mostly done by women. There were many different styles of embroidery, but because folks were essentially stealing patterns from each other, which they refer to as stealing by the eye, there are probably as many different styles as there are finished embroidery objects in the world. This is another work which I titled Birdsong, but in white. It features a Croatian weaving with a Hungarian pattern on it, which assumes the color of its new context and negotiates the open work seen at the bottom. Again, this gesture is to flatten hierarchies. One of the web addresses I included is a YouTube link to a folk song about a bird. The song is in Hungarian from the Csángó people of the Moldova region of Romania. Some ethnographers consider the Csángó people to hold intact some of the oldest and most authentic elements of Hungarian folk culture. I find this fascinating because the Moldova region has never actually been part of Hungary over its 1,000-year history. What does it mean for an entity to locate part of its core outside of itself? Echo exemplifies my ongoing concern with the relationship between image and sound. In this specific context, I translated embroidery patterns into sound by using an image-to-sound converter. The DNA of each pattern, from regions both inside and outside of current national borders, is translated into a sonic equivalent of itself. The distinct tracks create a soundscape where origin is difficult to locate. This is the conversion app that I use. On the right, you see a pattern from Transylvania, currently in Romania, and on the right, you see a pattern from central Hungary. This is a work which contains links to all the research I've done so far in the form or shape of a tree of life. This is a piece I'm currently working on, featuring a pillowcase with identical patterns on both sides, and it's going to be displayed on two half pedestals, one side bearing a label claiming it to be Hungarian in origin, the other side with a label claiming it to be Romanian in origin. Another work in progress involves more pattern to sound conversion, turning resulting sound to musical notations, collaborating with folk singers to sing those notations, and finally producing a vinyl record with tracks on one side from within contemporary Hungary and tracks on the other side from regions outside the current national borders. Thank you for listening.